In this lesson, we're going to look at fractions, decimals, and percent. And the reason we have the little arrows between them is that we're going to look at how to switch between those different forms. If you look at this diagram, you can see 4 different ways of representing the same thing. The first one is an area model where there are 100 squares in total and 37 out of those 100 squares are shaded in. We can represent that same value by writing a fraction, 37 over 100 or 37 100ths. The same value can be expressed as 0.37 or decimal 37. And we can also write that as a percent. 37% of the squares are shaded in. And we're going to look at those representations of values one at a time and then look at the conversions. So if we look first at decimals, they are a type of fraction, but they're a type of fraction that only uses powers of 10 as denominators. So for instance, the denominators can only be 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, etc. We're going to look at the place value of this example, 512.3742. And we're going to look at the value of each of the numbers there. So this first number, the 5, it's in the 100ths place. So it actually represents 5 100ths or 500. This 1 is in the tens place. So it represents one group of 10 or 110, so it's 10. The 2 is in the ones place. So it's 2 times 1 or 2 ones, okay? The decimal we often could read as, so this could be 512 and 3,742 10,000ths. But we usually say 0.3742. Okay, the first number after the decimal place is always in the 1/10ths position. So this represents 3/10ths. The 7 is in the hundredths position, so it represents 7 100ths. The 4, the third decimal place over, represents 1,000ths. Okay, third decimal place over, 3 zeros after the 1, okay? And that 2 finally represents 2 10,000ths. Okay, so those are the positions of each of the digits in that number. Let's take a look at these examples of decimals and write them as fractions. So for example, 5.32 could be written as 5 and 32 100ths. And we could reduce that by dividing the numerator and denominator by 4 and having 5 and 8/25. Question B is 512 decimal 089. So that's 512. And the 0 there is a placeholder but doesn't have any value, so we don't have to write it down. It's 89. And because there's 3 decimal places, it's 89 1,000ths. So it's very careful. You need to be very careful to count your decimal places to get the fraction denominator correct there. Then 7.6 will be 7 and 6/10ths, or 7 and 3/5 if we reduce it. And finally, question D is 3 and 7,069 10,000ths. So here are 4 for you to try for yourself. Perhaps press pause, try them, and check your answers after you hit play. So 21.6 will be 21 and 6/10ths, which you can reduce to 21 and 3/5. 0.763, there's no whole number part there, so it's going to be 763 1,000ths. Question C is 1 and 2/100ths, 2 decimal places. So it's 100ths, and we could reduce that to 1 and 1/50th. And finally, the last one will be 57 and 2,197 over 10,000. And hopefully you got those correct, and you'll have opportunity in class to practice more of those. Percents are also a type of fraction. For instance, 45% means 45 out of 100, or 45/100ths. The denominator with percents is always 100. One thing to note, though, is that percents might also include decimal parts or fractions. For example, you could borrow money for a car loan, and the interest rate might be 2.35% or 3.25% interest. Both methods, whether it's fraction or decimal, are often used within percents. In order to solve problems, you really need to be able to do a lot of converting between all three formats, fraction, decimal, and percent. So we're going to practice some of those now. So in the first section here, we're going from percent to fraction, and the rule is drop the percent symbol, include 100 as the denominator, and then simplify the fraction if possible. So 12% becomes 12/100ths. And by factoring a 4 out of the numerator and the denominator, I get 3/25ths. 153% gives us 153/100ths. Notice that that's an improper fraction, so we could divide by 100 and we'll have 1, and we'll have 53/100ths left over. Okay? It's important to think of fractions as percents. The whole number 1 means 100%. So that means all of the fraction, for instance. So anytime you have a fraction that's a percent that's over 100, you're going to get a mixed number with a whole number part and a fraction part. 6.5%, we're going to drop the percent symbol, put 100 as a denominator, and so we get 6.5 over 100. We cannot leave it in that form because we can't include a decimal in a fraction. So in this example, instead of factoring out a 4 like we did in question A, in this example, we're going to multiply the numerator and the denominator by 10 or 100 or 1,000 or whatever we need to get rid of the decimal in the numerator. So in this case, we've got 1 decimal place. So if we multiply the numerator and the denominator by 10, we end up with 65 over 1,000. And now we can simplify it once more by dividing by 5 and getting 13 over 200. Again, you might want to press pause and try these 3 examples here. So 3% becomes 3/100ths. 216% becomes 2 and 16/100ths, or 2 and 4/25ths. And 8.25% becomes 8.25 over 100. And we actually need to multiply by 100 because we have 2 decimal places there. So we'll multiply numerator and denominator by 100. You don't need to write that part out. But then we get 825. So now we have a whole number in the numerator over 10,000. And that's going to reduce by something. So let me think. 25 will go into both of those. And 25 into 800 will be 32 plus 1, so that'll be 33 in the numerator. And 25 into 1,000 is 40, so it'll be 400 into 10,000. You might want to check that math for me with your calculator. Okay, so that's percent to fraction. Now let's do percent to decimal. So when we start with a percent to decimal, we will drop the percent symbol and divide by 100. So for example, 35% will become 35. But we need to divide by 100. There's a nice quick way of dividing by 100, and that's taking the decimal place from where it was and inserting it 2 places more. So dividing by 100 makes a number smaller, so we move the decimal place to the left. When a number doesn't have a decimal place, it's at the end of the number. So there's my decimal place. I'm going to just switch colors for a second. So there's my original decimal place. I'm going to move it 2 places, so that's where it becomes. So we end up with the number 0.35, and that's where the decimal place goes. The 230% will do the same thing. We'll move the decimal place from after the 0 here, and we'll move it 2 spaces, so it ends up after the 2. So we end up with 2.30 as our decimal. Okay, and remember, because that's over 100%, we end up with a whole number. So we have 2 and 30/100ths, or 3/10. Okay, our 5%, we need to move the decimal place over 2 spaces. I'm going to just write it a little bit bigger here. When we move it and we've got no more numbers to go, we start filling in zeros and putting the decimal place in. So we end up with decimal 0.5. And we usually put, if there's no whole number part, we usually put a 0 before the decimal as well. 1.3% is similar in that we need extra spaces, so we end up with 0.013 as the equivalent decimal. Again, there's 3 more for you to try. Try them, press pause first to try them, and then play to check if they're correct. So 15% dividing by 100 will give us 0.15. 160% dividing by 100 will give us 1.60. And I would be okay if you wrote that as 1.6 and dropped the 0. And 7.5% will become 0.075. Okay, let's move on now to decimals to percent. Notice here we dropped the percent and divided by 100. Now we're going backwards, so we're going to multiply by 100 and then include the percent symbol. So 0.32, I'm multiplying it by 100. So this time the decimal place is going to the right 2 spaces, so this becomes 32%. 0.021, when I move the decimal place, it's going to end up right after that 2. So we end up with 2.1%. With the 5.6, I actually need to add zeros after the numbers. I'll just write that out here. I've got 5.6. I want to move that decimal space twice, so I actually have to include a 0 so that I can put the decimal there. So we end up with 560%. Again, which makes sense because we have a whole number portion, so we have a percent that's greater than 100. Again, there's 3 more here for you to try and check your answers with. So 1.56 will give us 156%. 0.16 will give us 16%. and 0.003 gives us 0.3%. Okay, it's very possible to have a decimal within a percent. Okay, so now fractions to decimals. This is the one where for some questions you might need to use a calculator depending on the numbers that you're given. So let's take a look at the examples here that we have. 3/4, I'm actually going to do 3 divided by 4. And I could use long division, and I'll just do that off to the side here. If I have 3 and I'm dividing 4 into it, 4 doesn't go into 3, so I'm going to put a decimal place in and change that to 3.0. But I'm not going to think about the decimal place. I'm going to just think 4 into 30. Well, 4 into 30 is 7 times. 7 times 4 is 28. I can subtract and I get 2. I'll just stick another 0 after that decimal place, bring it down. So now I have 20. 4 into 20 is 5 times. 5 times 4 is 20. Subtract, and I'm finished because I have a remainder of 0. My answer is complete when I put the decimal place directly above the decimal place in the divisor. Okay, so 3/4 actually equals 0.75. And if you think about 3/4 of a dollar, you get 75 cents, so that one makes perfect sense. 5 2/5 becomes, if you did 2 divided by 5 using long division or your calculator, you'll get 0.4. So this gives you 5.4. Okay? Sometimes you're going to need to use a repeating decimal symbol, or you might be asked to round, depending on the type of question. And an example would be the fraction 6/9. If I do 6 divided by 9 on my calculator, I'm going to get 0 point, and the calculator might just not show that number ever ending. And we write that as 0.6 with a little line above it to show that that 6 repeats. If we needed to round off the number because we wanted to know the approximate length of something, we use a wavy equals sign to show that we've rounded, and we might say 0.67. Okay, we're saying it's approximately equal to 0.67. It's exactly equal to 0.6 repeating. Now, one thing to notice about fractions that have nice denominators, like our first 2 fractions here in question A and B, those are actually quite easy to convert to fractions with 10 or 100 as our denominators. So for instance, 3/4, I can't get 10 as my denominator, but if I multiply by 25, I get 100 as my denominator. So I would get 175 100ths, which by definition is 0.75. So when you've got nice denominators, and by nice denominators I mean factors of 10, 100, or 1000, you can maybe do the conversion very quickly in your head by just converting the fraction to having a new denominator. So again, a few questions for you to try, and then check if your answers are correct. 17/25 is one of those that's fairly easy to convert. By multiplying numerator and denominator by 4, we end up with 100 in the denominator and 68 in the numerator, and so we get 0.68. 57/50ths will be similar. If we just multiply numerator and denominator by 2, we get 114 100ths, or 1.14. And 5/11ths, that's when we're going to use a calculator. And that's one that I forgot to do, so I'll let you do that one and we can take it up in class. Oops. And finally, going from fraction to percent, this one actually takes 2 steps. We go from fraction to decimal first, and then go from that decimal to our percent. So we'll use our previous examples. 3/4 was equal to 0.75, which if we multiply by 100 and add a percent symbol, we get 75%. The 5 2/5 was equal to 5.4, which if we multiply by 100, we get 540%. And the 6/9 gave us 0.67 when we rounded, which would give us 67%. Now, this is the approximate value with rounding. If we did it without rounding, we would say 0.6 repeating. And if we multiplied that by 100, we would have 66.6 repeating percent, which is often written as 66 2/3%, including the fraction in the percent. And that is the end of this lesson.